こんばんは.
Shab Khair.
Good evening.
I'm Megumi. I'm from Tokyo, born and raised here.
I'm Minsky from Tehran and living in Tokyo.
I'm Gemma from Australia, being in Tokyo.
This is the 5th episode of Movement for Room 303 Radio, a 6-part series that examines resistance to the status quo and confronts long-lasting injustices in the places we call home, from Tokyo to Tehran.
In tonight's episode, we're talking about the military. So, recruitment tactics, the militarization of everyday life, the military-industrial complex, so that's who makes profit from war, myth-making and nationalism, imperialism, especially US imperialism in Japan, and of course, resistance to that.
We are also going to be talking to a friend who lives in Okinawa amongst the huge US military presence. Leia, who went to school on a US military base in Japan, and Sam, who was pestered by US Army recruitment in school.
Speaking of being pestered by army recruitment in school, let's start with some questions around like propaganda and the sanctification of war. What are some of the ways you guys experienced it? Like Minsky in Iran and Megumi in Japan. What's something wild, or what's the experience that you were marinated in growing up with relation to the military?
Sure. I mean, I grew up on a military base in Iran. My mom went to nursing, university to become a nurse, and it was like funded and sponsored by military. And as a result, we got like subsidized housing of military. So I grew up there. My grandfather was in the army. In Iran, we have like 3 types of armies, 2 of which is called Sepah and IRCG, which you might hear on the news, which is like they are basically revolutionary guards. They are built, or they're made out after the revolution, and their main job is to protect the interest of the leader and the Islamic Republic. And there's no nationalistic, flavor to them. They're more Islamic, and the regime, like the government flavor a lot of it, and they protect the assets. Like one of them, very strong presence. They have access to telecom, they have access to a lot of assets of Iran and resources. They control the telco. They control pretty much everything, and they belong almost to the leader. And then the military base I grew up with is the national military that's kind of quite defunded. They existed pre-revolution. The kingdom that we had, it was their army, and they kind of survived the revolution and like transitioned. And there's like very similar to, I think, to some extent, U.S. Army. They go to military academy, and there's a school, and they get trained for the battle. But the other 2 ones that I mentioned was not like that. And I think what my experience of being, growing up on a military base, I was in the downtime or post-defunded kind of era of it. I don't remember the glorious days. But my mom was a child to a military general at the time, so she has much better memories of how it used to be pre-revolution. And they were like, they had a lot of good, parties and like good packages. Like their lifestyle was pretty nice. But after the revolution, it was like kind of like, I think a lot of people don't want to join the military now, unless you're very pro-government, and that you wouldn't join the national military. You would join the Revolutionary Guard or the other one who has all the resources. My experience of it was very kind of strict. Like every time I went home, I had to show my card to get into the complex, obviously. And I'm pretty sure our phones were monitored. Because sometimes I would hear sounds. I don't think the technology was good enough to block. I don't know. Sometimes there was like some weird stuff that I would hear over the phone. I was like, oh, somebody's listening. What I experienced was, I think the government was really worried about the nationalistic aspect of our military because they wanted to defund. They don't like the identity that comes with, I think a lot of militaries, like U.S. military, there's like definitely a strong flavor of nationalism and like protecting the country. And I remember my grandfather had that. Like he was so kind of like Iran forever, Iranian blood. I will fight for it. And he did for 8 years, Iran-Iraq war. But I think post that, it kind of, that image was defunded, and the image of you should protect the Islamic Republic was kind of boldened. That's my experience. How about you, Megumi?
Well, my experience, it's not as like tangible, I feel, but I mean, my uncles in the US, my mom's side, a lot of them were in the military back then. They went to Vietnam, all of it. And I feel like whenever I go back to the US, they have like in that generation, they get like a plaque or something for their license, like car license or whatever. And so some of my uncles have it on their truck saying like a veteran or whatever. And it's like an interesting scenery because I'm so not used to seeing that in Japan. But I guess for my Japanese experience, there's two sides of it, which like the Japanese military defense force, which like almost zero to none, honestly, interaction, I feel. Like they won't come to your school. They don't talk about like join the military. Not a lot of recruitment happens in schools at all, at least to my experience. I don't know. I don't think that happens to any Japanese kids. However, on the opposite side, there's a ton of U.S. U.S. military influence in Japan. One of the most amount of bases, U.S. bases, is in Japan as well too, and like it's in Okinawa, which we will talk about later as well. But one time there's a base in Yokosuka in Yokohama, and when I was a kid, maybe like I was 7 or 8 years old, there's this day called Friendship Day between America and Japan, and so they would open up the base amongst everybody because it's usually not open to the public, only to who are Japanese people. But that day specifically, they will open it up to Japanese citizens. You have to bring your passport, show your whole fucking identity, whatever. I did just look it up that like they might not have people who are not other than Japanese or American citizens, which is like so weird. But at this festival, basically it's just kind of like a cookout or whatever. And also the thing I went to was a helicopter show and like an Air Force show. So they like just play their little airplanes in front of you. And like the kids are like, whoa, so cool, mommy. So yeah, I went to go see that once. And then the thing I haven't experienced but heard a ton was on this Friendship Day, another day of the year, is when they open it up to people can do like shopping. So they can like shop in the base, and the base is notoriously known to have like a ton of American shit all over. So you can get toothpaste that's from America, or you can get like Cheetos or Diet Coke, which I love. But like a bunch of this stuff, people will go there, line up for 4 hours in the scorching sun and like go there on that day. So that's kind of my understanding / sort of, relationship to military stuff.
And I also remember hearing that the only place you can get the morning after pill over the counter in Japan is at the US Army base. Like if you go in and say like, hey,
really?
I slept with a soldier last night, I need one, they'll give it to you, no questions asked.
Oh, wow.
Word on the street.
I'm not going to fucking go to Yokohama to do that, though. Probably easier to just go to the doctor the next day. Yeah, to get it prescribed. to have a child. Wow, okay. What about you, Gemma? Is there anything in particular?
I guess in Australia, like so much of Australia's national identity, and I put Australia and national identity in chongchongs, is built on the Anzacs. And ANZAC stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. And basically, when World War I broke out, Australia sent a lot of soldiers over. And like the first project that we were assigned to was Gallipoli. And it was just a big stitch up, basically. And like all the soldiers arrived facing like territory that they absolutely couldn't conquer. They made no territorial gain. Just so many thousands of people died. It was just trench warfare for months, and it was like seen as a ginormous failure. So the way that was like packaged and sold to everybody as like a glorification thing was like stoicism and mateship and courage. And from that was born a culture of like, of those things, I suppose. And like, even when I was in school in year 7, we spent like months making pretend care packages for the Anzac soldiers, like knitting them socks, baking them Anzac cookies. And Anzac soldiers also fought again in World War II, in Vietnam, in Korea, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Kokoda. And yeah, we had conscription in World War I and World War II and the Vietnam War. But although I had grandparents who fought in wars, or great-grandparents who fought in wars, I didn't have immediate grandparents who fought in wars. The military definitely came to my school, but I guess like war and army is still so glorified. And like I have a relative who works in an RSL, which is a retired servicemen's league, which is like a cheap place for veterans to go and drink and gamble. And like just to give you an example of how glorified that day is, in 2017, a woman that I worked with at the same co-working space in Sydney, her name is Yasmin Abdul Majid. She tweeted something that just said, "Lest we forget," which is like the Anzac Day saying, "Lest we forget the soldiers." And she said, "Lest we forget," and then in brackets after it, she put maybe like Manus Island, which is like where an Australian detention centre is. She put Palestine, she put Syria, being like, this is a day of reflection for people who've died in war. Let's remember all of it. And the public outcry in response to that was so enormous, with like media commentators, the general public, and even Australian politicians calling for her and making petitions for her to lose her job, be killed, and be deported. And she just received so many death threats that even though she's an Australian citizen, she was born in Sudan, she ended up moving away from Australia in order to feel safe. So that culture of like the sacrilege, whatever it is, it's sacred. It's like an untouchable thing that you can't critique. And yeah, I guess we also sent so many Aboriginal people to go and fight in the wars as well. And then they were never properly recognised. And only today are they like kind of being allowed to march. So yeah, that's the Australian situation.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point because, like that sacredness, I totally remember my grandfather used to like mention it before, like about how it used to be. But for us, I think because I guess there's also this argument of functional governments versus dysfunctional ones that you see like they absolutely failed. So I think anything that comes from, when you see some organization or institution or government failing, I think their kind of arms of power or how they exercise their power become kind of more questioned. So it's not the glory days of Iranian government. That's why I think it's very hard to think of the army as a sacred like type of body.
Fully, like the myth collapsed so quickly,
Right.
showing that it was just a myth.
Right.
In a
right.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And they did try to it's also interesting, like when you say in Australia it's very sacred, what are the, I guess, undertones or flavors to it? Because in Iran, like they really try to steer the narrative of like my grandfather went to war because he liked to protect Iran, let's say, or defend the country. But there's this like massive, I guess, propaganda like force and push to say that those people who died in the war died for the leader. They didn't die for the country. So it's like how you steer like their death even, make meaning of that.
I've never heard that perspective ever.
Yeah, they like banked on it, and that like I think it was a proxy war that America started through Iraq. So they like kind of tipped off Saddam Hussein, be like, "Hey, do you want to go take over the southern part of Iran because they're ethnically Arabs?" And he was like, "Oh, great," because at the time he actually had the backing of the U.S. He was kind of U.S. appointed, and he attacked, and our government, despite it was a defense from Iranian side, our government prolonged the war because they realized despite US effort to like make the government weaker, they could bank on the fact that when there's a war, people are not going to think about democracy. So they prolonged the war that was supposed to end in 3 years to like something about 7 to 8 years. And actually that made the government a lot stronger because people who lost sons in the war and like who lost like loved ones, they would be like, "Look, your son went to war because of us. He wanted Islamic like values to be like protected." Like a lot of it was not true. Some of them might have. But that's an interesting. I wonder, like in Australia, when you say it's sacred, is it the nationalistic aspect? So you're like basically saying no. If you say no to military, you're saying no to your heritage or culture.
Yeah, I guess it's just the successful perpetuating and creation of this national myth that like, they died for us, but because Australia as a newly established state doesn't have that much culture, the meaning has been so lost. So there are probably some people who are like, they died so we can celebrate Christmas. Don't let them call it Present Giving Day. Like it's sort of filtered down to that. But it's just so devastating. And I guess I want to make the point that even though we're sort of mocking this myth making, we understand that it's like vulnerable communities that are being targeted, and this myth making is part of government propaganda or like whatever body's propaganda to convince people to give their lives or give their children's lives to fight for this greater good. And if you do lose someone, it's obviously easier to find meaning in their death if you can think that they died for a cause.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Or making war as a whole a sacred thing, which absolutely happens.
Absolutely.
So now we go back to Okinawa. In case you didn't know, nearly half of all U.S. military is deployed abroad, with the greatest number of those troops stationed in Japan. 70% of those are in Okinawa. We jumped on the phone with someone in the community. We asked him, what's the situation on the ground?
So in Okinawa, there has been resistance against the bases pretty much ever since they created the bases post-war time. And it's come in waves, especially when Okinawans become victim of some kind of crime such as rape or death or murder or something like that, then the support against the bases increases substantially. What I'm saying is that over the years, there have been many cases of rape or death, and at those times you have higher numbers of people protesting. At this current state, right now, the protests are not as strong, even though they have had sexual assault cases recently. I think there is a sort of exhaustion and maybe a bit of a hopelessness. Okinawans have learned over time that even though they've protested for decades at this point, not much has changed.
We also asked him, is there any representation in the government for the kind of opposition in Okinawa?
The current governor, Denny Tamaki, is pretty anti-base. He was pretty much elected because he was anti-base. However, over the years, the LDP, Jiminto, who is pretty pro-base, has gained some seats and has also gained some political positions in certain key areas like the Henoko or Nago area, which is where the new base is being built. And the way I think that they often get this support is by acting like they're not pro or anti-base, right? So they just are ambiguous about their position, and then they just talk about economy. Because of Okinawa is the poorest prefecture in Japan, economy is a huge thing for Okinawans here, and I think that's how they often get elected. It's similar to America as well. You know, when the economy is bad, just as the most recent election, people tend to vote based off of that more than any other topic or subject.
We also asked him who is resisting in Okinawa and what are they resisting? What do they want?
Yeah, there's many groups that are resisting the bases. You have the base protesters, anti-base protesters at Henoko who go there pretty much every day to try to stop the trucks from going in. They sit in front of the base entrance, and then the policemen move them. Once they're moved, the trucks go through. So there are other methods that people employ. Some people will try to just stop the military trucks whenever they see them, whenever they're going anywhere, kind of thing. There are people protesting against the chemicals that are leaked out of the bases. PFAS, I don't know if you're familiar with PFAS, but PFAS levels have been found to be quite elevated in Okinawa, especially around the bases. Especially, I think, like groups of mothers who are against this PFAS contamination. There are people against the noise pollution, because noise pollution is quite a big problem here. And there have been lawsuits against the military and the Japanese government, I believe, to fight against the noise pollution. And they actually have won, so they get some kind of like money out of everything, out of the lawsuit, but still the sound doesn't decrease necessarily because they won, right? It's just sort of compensation for their damages, I guess. The way that some anti-base protesters, especially in the Henoko region where the new base is being created, see some success is that they believe that they've delayed the building of the base, and I think there is an argument to say that they have, that as long as they can continue to delay it as much as possible, it gives them time to maybe even think of other things that might be more effective or something like that. And maybe the other win is that being out there and doing this protest gives them media attention. And so maybe through that media attention, they believe that, some kind of outside pressure or something might push Japan or the US to stop the building of the space or something like that. But they've also, I want to say it's 2017, but they had a referendum, a prefectural referendum about the new base being built in Henoko. I want to say around 75% were against the base, so voted against the base. You would think that because of this referendum and Japan being a democratic nation, that this would change something, but it was completely ignored. They just continued to plow through and make this base, despite the prefecture mostly being against it.
We also ask him if there's any free press reporting on this. Like, what's the local media like?
Okinawa Times, Ryukyu Shimpo, these are the major sort of news organizations in Okinawa, and they're very much against the bases, to the extent that they're called communists and all these things.
He also talks about the arguments for and against the military presence in Okinawa.
People who know things about the base are generally against the base. However, I will say that the newer generation who has been born and raised only knowing an Okinawa that has bases, they don't feel as averse, or they don't feel as against the bases, and they don't really understand why to that. And then on top of that, this whole China threat and North Korea threat makes them feel like having bases is maybe safer for them. Although the other argument is that they'd be targets. There's substantial argument or substantial evidence to say that they would be targets, because there's just so many bases condensed into one location, right? 70% of US bases in Japan are in this small island. It's just like a huge bullseye on the island, right? If you can take out a lot of the military forces on this island, then you'd probably have an advantage militarily, I think. But the other the other argument is like, well, Okinawa, because we have the bases, it's such a deterrent to attack, right? They wouldn't dare attack because we have so many bases so close to Taiwan and China. Okinawan students are learning less about the history of Okinawa and what they went through. In general, Japanese students don't learn that much about it, World War II in history classes. In Okinawa, in the past, they've always heard stories from their grandparents, right? Or their parents, hearing it from their parents, right? They knew about that history, the horrors of the war, and the discrimination against Okinawans. However, the older generation starts passing away. They don't get this information as much. They don't feel as anti-war, anti-base as the older generations once did.
And lastly, we ask him if there are any everyday ways that the government or their fears, or the government is exploiting people's fear to justify the military presence there.
I think there are things that Japan does. I don't want to get into conspiracy theories or anything like that, but One thing that is used is we have these warnings that come to our cell phones when you get like a major earthquake or something. Everybody's phone starts going off, right? But in Okinawa, we get national alert or prefectural alerts when North Korea sends a rocket up into the air. However, I mean, most of the time, North Korea has announced that they were going to do a rocket, shoot up a rocket. And most of the time, I think it's for like weather purposes or like weather satellites or something like that. They shoot the rockets. There's not much context. Everybody just thinks North Korea is shooting rockets over Okinawa, and that scares Okinawan people, right? Creates fear in them. So that kind of thing, I think it adds to the fear, and maybe people think, okay, maybe it's a good thing to have U.S. bases here. These rocket launches are announced, and oftentimes, actually almost every time, they're for some kind of weather purpose or something like that.
Wow. So wild.
That's a
Yeah.
lot of dense information. Thank you. Wow.
Yes. Thank you, anonymous source. Megumi, when you were in school in Japan, what awareness what was the education system telling you about the military presence in Japan or in Okinawa? Anything?
I mean, what he said, almost 0 to none, I feel, at least to my recollection. It's been a long time. But yeah, I can't remember. Surely there was some, but not to an extent where this is a political issue or a discussion that people are having. And like, not to an extent that as an adult, I look it up by myself and I'm like, oh, Okinawans' land is being taken. Like their land is being taken by the American government. Like not to that context. It wasn't that contextualized back then, 100%. So I would say, I'm sure I was taught, but anybody in Japan, history is often like, it's not erased, but it's just kind of never been, even if it has been taught, people don't, there was a topic about like your grandparents passed away, so now that stories are not being told generation and it's not being passed down. That is a big thing, not only generationally but also just amongst day-to-day life, like amongst friends as well. Like honestly, Japanese people are quite not familiar with their own history sometimes, I think. Not to generalize, but I think often the case, at least with my Japanese friends, I felt that a lot. But yeah, I guess that's my answer to that.
That is such an interesting phenomenon that has always fascinated me, how quickly people do forget. Like in most cultures that I have encountered, and like, yeah, especially in Australia, I am so bewildered and disgusted by how complacent everybody is when it's like, don't you remember that like 3 generations ago or 2 generations ago, your relatives were like anti-police revolutionaries? And
It's just so recent, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the U.S. occupation, when the U.S. was occupying Okinawa was 1952, something like that, 70 years ago.
people were
like
alive.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. My grandparents are dead, but like, I mean, people are still alive. Absolutely. So it's like, it's really not like, oh my God, centuries ago, which is really crazy to think about. Like, it really wasn't a long time ago. And like, I know that there has been a lot of resistance movement at that time during the 50s to 70s where people were, again, that idea, obviously like the thing of being occupied, your land being occupied by another country, but also on top of that, there's this physical force of like, gradually your town is like, I feel like people need to, if they don't have a great grasping of like what the impact is like in Okinawa, just look up a Google pic of like how the base is. There's just no way that you can escape. Like, we've all been to Okinawa.
Yeah.
Like, you just can't escape it. Like, the base is in every corner of your eyesight, everywhere. You like are in your car with your parents, like, and you're like, oh, why is traffic happening? Oh, because there's like a ton of lines for people to go into their base or what. It's just like, what is it? Like, the wire, gauges or whatever, like just alongside the street casually, and it's all over in the middle of the town, just casually right there. It really is shocking to see how it's so instilled into people's daily lives. And I feel like, yeah, it's just shocking. And like, I think to the point of like what this person was saying, that like people are not so maybe informed nowadays, or people who are born into it, it's kind of like they're not like anti-war or anti-base, if anything. I'm like, damn, I even have some empathy for them, because it's like, if you grew up with it, like people have noise complaints all the time. Sexual violence was mentioned in the thing as well, but like noises, pollution, sexual violence, of course, but like schools, apparently during classes, teachers have to like yell and scream sometimes, because these planes are literally just like, you know, trying to land so low to the schools, because it's so instilled in the cities. Like it's right there into the towns, like the base that is trying to be replaced right now, Futenma, for instance, like that literally by the American minister, whoever called it the world's most dangerous base or whatever, because it's like literally this most scary base that's just like slapped on a little, like not a little, a huge airplane, like what is it called, the landing strip or whatever, right in the middle of a town where kids go to school or whatever. It's just like, yeah, I mean, fuck, they grew up with that shit. So like, what would they know otherwise? But then of course they would get told these stories from their parents that it used to not be like this, etc. But yeah, I rambled through that, but it's just so, yeah, it's sometimes disheartening to kind of like actually see the effects of what's happening at the base, and the results of having bases in Okinawa, I think.
Absolutely. And even like what that person was just touching on with regards to like the sexual violence and the deaths, which is like murders. I used to like be in a share house with somebody in Tokyo who was a attorney for the US Navy or whatever, Army, whatever it is down there. And he, like his specific job was to defend soldiers in rape cases against local Japanese women. And he was so proud of the fact that he'd never lost a case. And one really cool piece of resistance that I saw was that an Okinawan newspaper, in their TV guide, instead of publishing the shows that were on television that week, they published the name of like everybody who had been sexually assaulted by the US Army, like in the paper, as an act of resistance. But yeah, there are just obviously so many leaking on effects. I guess also in the flavor of US military bases, we have a dear friend, Leia. Megumi, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, please. This is a snippet from Leia. I guess it's distributed into 2 parts, probably.
No, we've got it in 3, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah, she speaks about her experience. She grew up, she's half Ghanaian, half Japanese, grew up in multiple places in the world, actually, America, Japan, Ghana as well, too. But this is her experience when she grew up in sorry, I am blanking out the base in Japan. She wasn't in Yokosuka, which is like the main base in Japan, but somewhere else. She does mention it in the snippet.
Yeah, basically, like, what was her experience like going to school on a military base?
So I went to school on 2 military bases in Japan, the Negishi base and the Yokosuka base, sometime between 2001 and 2008. So my entirety of elementary school, as well as 6th grade, which would be middle school in the US, base life was slightly different between Negishi and Yokosuka. So Negishi was a significantly smaller base. From my memory, it was almost entirely residential. So there weren't a lot of people that I know of that were really like working on the base. Maybe there were, but it didn't feel as much of a Navy military community as did Yokosuka, which had much larger security gates. It was more difficult to get in. It was a bigger base with more of the uniformed presence. It was interesting. I mean, I felt like I had the quintessential suburban American school experience because I went to school on base. All the teachers were American, all of our books, the architecture in the school, our learning material, my classmates, everything was American. And so much of my identity as a child was Americanized naturally.
All right. And then we asked her, why did your parents choose to send you to military school?
My parents were not involved in the military whatsoever. My father is Ghanaian, my mother is Japanese. From my understanding, they paid tuition, which was on par with the tuition fees for international schools in Japan at the time. So they paid those fees in order for my sister and I to attend these schools. So I guess it's sort of the equivalent in university of paying out-of-state tuition. It was sort of the non-American tuition is what we were paying in order to go to this school. My parents explained that as an attempt to give my sister and I as normal of an environment as possible as mixed race children living in Japan from a working class, low middle class family. If they had sent us to an international school, we would have been surrounded by upper class, very, very wealthy kids, and their image, I think, of that environment just didn't sit well with them. They wanted us to have a more grounded experience. I think they wanted us to be a bit more down to earth. But also they had a lot of friends, my dad especially, because he worked, selling clothing that was very much inspired by like the hip hop movement. He had a lot of Black friends, African American friends that were in the military, and so I think he felt comfortable sending us to school there because he knew there'd be a decent number of half Black kids and half Japanese kids in school. So that was their decision in sending us to school there, and they were right. I mean, my best friends from first grade all the way to sixth grade were all half Japanese, half African American girls, and it was really special to be able to come of age in that sort of environment and just not feel like that part of my identity was to be questioned in any way. But anyway, I digress. My parents weren't in the military at all. We paid money to attend public school, an American public school, really.
And then lastly, we ask her, how has her opinion changed throughout over time?
My opinion hasn't necessarily changed about the schooling experience per se. I think that was really wonderful, and it gave me a strong sense of security in being mixed at the time. I didn't feel like I was different or othered because of my mixedness, because so many of my classmates shared that very important identity marker. So it felt like there was this automatic sense of community. That being said, now that I have a better awareness of why the bases exist and the history and the politics behind that, I don't think it should exist. I think all of the bases should absolutely, like, their existence has to be revisited. I think there's too much of a stronghold, too much of a presence. Maybe in the Tokyo Kanagawa area, it's not as politically tense as it might be in Okinawa, but I still think that it's bizarre that these large plots of land have been sort of like given to the US, and their military presence impacts Japan so intimately. But on the flip side, I think it's given birth to really interesting culture around the base. And I do think a significant proportion of the mixed race community does come to an extent from these communities. So it's sort of this like, yeah, I guess from a political standpoint, I don't think it should exist. From a cultural standpoint, if I were to remove myself, it's interesting to observe it as a phenomenon.
Yeah, that's also beautifully interesting commentary. Thank you so much, Leah, for that one.
Totally. Thank you, Leah. And yeah, like she raises such an interesting point about the diversity of the military.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating the point she made about like the juxtaposition of like both being politically like, okay, I don't know if I agree with this, but also being raised as a Hafu kid in Japan, she built a community in the base schooling system that was quite actually like very friendly and like familiar to her, I think. That I think is like a lot of Hafu kids will have a different experience. And like purposefully her parents, you know, put her in that system to have her a greater experience than like putting her in a different, because there are these circumstances that like if you're different, you're going to be treated differently probably. So like the juxtaposition of that, like, and to justify it as well too, to be like, oh, I don't agree with the system probably as an adult now in hindsight politically, but culturally looking at it, maybe was it a wholesome childhood? Sure. Like that is an interesting one. I do want to point out one thing. This is something that Leah has pointed out later on after this follow-up, but I'm going to quote her. But because most of the education, as she said, her parents were not in the military, so she was paying for an American public education, basically in Japan. Hence, what she was explaining to me, which I was surprised, on base, you get very minimal Japanese cultural context. Like you don't get taught a lot of Japanese culture. The language, forget about it. Like they don't even have Japanese language classes, like very bare minimum is what I heard. So for her, Leia, having like Japanese friends outside of the community, outside of base friends, I think was a big difference. Hence she had a lot of like ability to speak Japanese and like understanding of the culture as well. On the flip side, what she was calling military brat kids, these kids will probably not have sort of that profound understanding of the culture that the country that they live in, if anything.
Fully.
And then all this to say, she's saying the decision on part of the DODEA, which is the Department of Defense Education Activity, to create a highly American educational environment with bare minimum localized curriculum and an emphasis on instilling a sort of a patriotic, quote unquote, Americanness in their students could potentially be analyzed as the cultural arm of their neo-colonial agenda, maybe. And I mean, she used the word instilling, but I mean, propaganda, maybe, if anything, could even be. I mean, instilling is a very kind word, maybe, if anything. But DODEA is an interesting one, not to like go off of it too much because we're running out of time. But this is the institution that basically is creating American students standardized education systems, right? So base students are kids' schooling systems, because base to base students are always hopping around international countries all the time. They need to get back right on track right after where they left off. So their whole thing is by instilling standardized education system, they can always hop back right on of like where they left off. And so hence this DODEA is a couple years ago, or even a year ago, there was this like thing on like books banning, or like, let's not teach kids about like sexuality or gender or trans rights and et cetera, race and that kind of stuff. But this is an institution, or I guess like an institution that is teaching these base teachers and these base schooling systems to say, hey, this is the curriculum. We're not teaching our students this. And they give them this like syllabus or something to say that like, these are some sexual gender topics that we're not going to talk about. And like, they're quite specific. So I think that DODEA institution has a heavy impact on like a lot of the base students as well too, and what they ingest as like education system in themselves, which I think is a very interesting thing to touch on.
Totally, because like they're getting a diverse experience by way of their cohort, but then they're getting like a very sanitized American curriculum.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was just an interesting bit, but maybe we should move on, perhaps?
I guess so.
Yeah, there's just so much to cover, but also everybody just gave us brilliant audio clips that we could talk about this for probably 2 hours.
But still on the topic of American school systems.
True. Oh my God. That next week? Okay. Anyways.
No, but we have a conversation with somebody else.
Yes, who is American, actually. So this one is by Sam, who grew up in North Carolina, which is the most American place probably you could ever think of. We asked him about, well, he got recruited, I think, when he was in school. So he's just going to talk about what was that like.
Yeah.
What's up, Movement Radio? Been listening since episode 1, no big deal. Just wanted to tell you a little personal anecdote about military sort of recruitment, I suppose. I'm going to say this was all probably 20 years ago or more, so my memory may be a little hazy, but I will stick to the gist of it. I remember it to be true. But basically, when I was in high school, I had to take something called the ASVAB, which is, I think, Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, I think is right. And it's basically a test of, I think it's supposed to qualify you for just military service in general. It's sort of like there's some like maths questions. I think you had to answer some writing questions, and then you had to, I recall there being some like mechanical kinds of things, like if this gear is turning this way and this gear is turning this way, then which way is this gear going? Anyway, I think it must have been either mandatory or incentivized, because if it was optional, I wouldn't have done it, because I think I seem to recall it taking several hours. I took it in the auditorium. I don't know if that really matters, but the test was, I remember finding it like not difficult. I did quite well. I believe I scored in the top percentile or whatever the categorizing system is. And so as a result of that, the recruiter really was after me. And so they would be calling my house. No, I mean, I don't want to imply that it was constantly, but relatively frequently. And, my mom would be pretty annoyed by it because, with my mom, there's a little bit of contradiction because she's pretty red, white, and blue, wave the flag, like patriotic kind of a type. But also, so she definitely thinks like somebody should go to the military, but not my baby boy. So definitely my mom was not too keen on me going to the military. So she was kind of like, I think politely kind of asking the guy to like stop calling. But it wasn't, it didn't really strike me as a big deal. I mean, I talked to him sometimes too, and I always told him like, nah, man. It didn't really strike me as a big deal at all. And, but I think maybe that's kind of actually what's interesting about it, is that it was such a kind of a, not exactly routine, but it was something that was just passed off as like, oh yeah, just do this thing, and then, we'll see, ha ha ha. But yeah, it was kind of, in retrospect, it is kind of interesting that I could have, been, that decision could have, really obviously changed a lot, as far as like the outcome of my life or whatever. So, yeah, that's my little story about getting recruited, or attempted anyway.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. I mean, back then it was via phone calls, but today I was telling you guys, but it's like through TikTok. Like literally, I saw a bunch of TikToks. I was like, oh, in the Navy, we're looking for da da da, and they like make these cute videos or whatever, or like they're doing of course we're in the Navy, we do da da da, like they do the whole trend thing. It's just like, it's so in your lifestyle, I think, if you're in the States, and if you're specifically in that certain demographic that like the Navy wants you. And I don't know, in Japan at least, that's not something we're used to. Again, they won't come to your schools and that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting experience to hear.
Totally. And I guess the other thing I found so interesting about what Sam said, and even Minsky, you earlier, is that like sometimes the military, or the normalization of the military in our life is like so embedded that we don't even notice it. Like when we first asked Sam, had the military come to his school, he was kind of like, yeah, whatever, like this happened. I did this test and they called me for years. And we were like, what, dude? That's weird. That's weird. And he was like, is it? And even Minsky, you before, you were like, I don't really know much about the military. And then you're like, wait, I grew up on a base.
That was crazy.
It did occur to me, honestly. Like, it was not part of how I see myself or my identity. It was like, holy shit. Like, from age 7, like, literally from the time I started going to school to end of high school, I was living in a base. I didn't even notice. Like, or as an important fun fact.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. It really is so interesting. And like when I was just home in Australia, I drove, I don't know, maybe like 5,000 kilometer road trip, stopping at various pubs along the way. And every single pub basically is like homage, I've really known how to say that word, is a shrine to soldiers, whether it's like a mural or photos or like, you know, here's the cabinet with what the nurses used to wear and stuff like that. Like it's just absolutely everywhere. Yeah. Is it the part of the show where we ask if anything's given you hope?
I think we are at that point in the show to ask if anything gives us hope.
I do have a good one though. I have a friend who just spent several months in the West Bank and in Tel Aviv, and she met with various sources who revealed that the rate of absconsion of people joining the IOF is 50%. So half of the people who are getting conscripted into the Israeli military, remembering that it is conscription, are finding ways of getting out of service, whether that's through mental health, whether that's through other ways, whether that's through like, injuring themselves or whatever. But like there is so much resistance to forced conscription and joining the military, like, even in that instance. And that does give me so much hope that eventually, even when we see increased militarization of things like the police in the US, that eventually there won't be enough funding, there won't be enough people joining, and like it will fall. What about you guys?
I think for me, like, I actually believe that social media and like the fact that things that were maybe easier to normalize in the past have become a lot more difficult to normalize. People are talking about violence and especially war crimes. And there's this guy, he might be a bit controversial because his name is Steven Pinker. And he has this famous book and a talk called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he uses data to prove in his way, he's like a Harvard professor or something, and he proves that in his way that violence over time in the world have actually decreased. And he thinks that we should appreciate that. It doesn't mean that we are done, but he thinks that, it's like a very hopeful thing. One funny thing I saw in one of his talks was like, he talks about the like laws of old Britain, of like how it was so normalized to kill kids if they stole something. And he just very, as a matter of fact, read a bunch of like facts about what the laws were and stuff, like neutral face completely. It was like, holy shit, like the society, it was so normal to be so violent. So I think overall we as humans, we are I'm hopeful we are evolving in that sense. And we are relating to each other more, which makes it really hard to kill. Not for everybody, but I think, a big part of not being violent is to think that the other humans are actually humans and not subhumans, because it goes against our evolutionary, I think, nature to kill someone we find like alike to ourselves.
Well said. That gives me hope too.
I don't know. I guess like, what is it called Pacific Constitution? The Peace Constitution. Peace fit.
I don't know.
There's an English word for it. It's like Heiwa Shugi, like our amendment that's like the 9th article or whatever, where we declared like after the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we said no more of this shit. We're not doing war. That gives me hope. Like, I feel very privileged and I feel very safe, and like, not because of the military existence, but just because that in other parts of the world, there is a war happening. There are wars happening, but in Japan, we don't have that currently right now. And the thing that the military defense force will help out people is like when natural disasters happen, and like they will like help people and guide people at supermarkets to like get food. And like to me that's like, wow, the rest of the world is like crumbling and there's like literal wars happening, but this is kind of my reality at least. And there is a place to fall back, I guess, or people who can help us in a sense. I don't know why I'm paying homage to the Japanese Defense Force system, but it's more so that like there is a constitution that helps this country, that we're not going to war because of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yeah, that kind of just gives me hope in a sense. So, yeah.
Nice. We are going to go out on a song.
Yes. Since we only have a couple more minutes, and we did talk about Okinawa today, let's do the Okinawa song.
All right.
So this one, just for a little bit of context, this again happened. This song was very popularized during the 50s to the 70s. I think it was released like in the 1954 or something. Two men made it who was in the labor union, and now it's being sung by a couple people. But it's called Okinawa o Kaese, and it just means return our land, and it means return back Okinawa. And it's a cry of rallying songs about the military force, the U.S. occupation, and what it means to be Okinawan.
So in Okinawa, there has been resistance against the